April 25th, 1945, the day American troops first glimpsed the outskirts of Adolf Hitler's shattered capital Berlin. It was supposed to be a triumphal moment, the symbolic collapse of the Nazi regime that had plunged the world into total war. But the first thing American soldiers felt wasn't triumph, it was disbelief, a deep disorienting shock at the way reality contradicted every expectation they had carried across oceans and continents. For years, Berlin had been portrayed in newspapers, military briefings and propaganda as an impenetrable fortress of totalitarian power, the iron heart of the Third Reich, a place buzzing with fanatic stormtroopers ready to die for Hitler to the very last bullet. Instead, as the first US recon units crept through the bomb-cratered suburbs and into the charred, smoke-soaked city limits, they found something surreal, a gigantic metropolis that looked less like the capital of a terrifying superpower and more like the skeleton of a world that had already ended. Buildings stood gutted and hollow, their facades drooping like torn curtains, lampposts bent at impossible angles, and the streets those grand boulevards Americans had seen in newsreels filled with Nazi parades were now indistinguishable from trenches, clogged with rubble, abandoned carts, pulverized brick, shattered rail cars, burned-out tanks, and corpses left unburied because burial had become a luxury the dying city could no longer afford. What shocked American troops most was the silence. They had expected thunder, artillery, snipers, machine gun chatter, the roar of an enemy fighting in every alley. Instead, the first sounds to reach them were the cries of children hiding in basements, the distant rumble of Soviet bombardment on the opposite side of the city, and the uneasy echo of their own boots crunching over debris. The Berliners who emerged from makeshift shelters were grey figures, dressed in rags, gaunt from starvation, their faces ghost-pale with coal dust and fear, nothing like the proud, defiant Nazis US soldiers had been led to anticipate. Some were too weak to speak, others approached with trembling hands raised not out of Nazi fanaticism, but desperation, some begging for food, some for water, some simply for the soldiers to confirm that the nightmare was finally ending. And the smell that was another shock, a thick, sour mixture of smoke, sewage, burning rubber, decay, and the sickly sweet odour that every war veteran recognised instantly but never spoke about. Death left too long in the sun. American soldiers, hardened by battles in Normandy, the Ardennes and the Rhineland, still felt their stomachs churn. Berlin wasn't just destroyed, it was annihilated, a level of ruin that dwarfed anything they had seen in France or Belgium. But the shock didn't stop at the physical wreckage. What rattled them even more was what they found inside the ruined apartments and government buildings, evidence of a population that had clung to denial until the last possible moment. Half-burned propaganda posters promising total Sieg, total victory lay scattered beside handwritten notes begging God to intervene. Some walls still displayed framed portraits of Hitler, perfectly dusted even though the room around them was destroyed. Some tables still had plates set for meals that would never be eaten. In one building, soldiers found a Children S classroom where the teacher's final lesson, written in chalk, read, "We do not surrender. The Führer will save us." But the war had already moved on without them, leaving only the heartbreaking signs of a population misled until the point of starvation. And speaking of starvation, what truly stunned the troops was the utter collapse of civilian life. Berliners rummaged through garbage heaps for mouldy potato peels, mothers offered family heirlooms in exchange for a single Army K ration. One soldier wrote that he saw a woman trade her last wedding ring for half a can of American corned beef. They weren't the enemies now, they were survivors of a government that had spent its final resources not on food or medicine, but on defending Hitler's bunker and feeding his delusions. American soldiers also couldn't believe how quickly German civilians tried to switch sides emotionally, almost overnight. These were the same people who had lived under a regime that declared Americans degenerate invaders. Yet now Berliners pressed forward with desperate gratitude, treating the US troops not as conquerors, but as lifelines. Some soldiers later admitted that this confused them more than anything, how a city that had been the epicenter of Nazi fanaticism could collapse into pleading, terrified humanity so fast. But beneath the shock and devastation, another layer awaited, the discovery of Nazi atrocities. As US soldiers moved deeper into the city, they stumbled across evidence documents, abandoned offices, destroyed laboratories that showed how meticulously the regime had planned its domination of Europe. Files detailing deportations, medical experiments, and mass killings lay scattered across government floors. Some soldiers reported feeling physically sick when they realized just how systemized the terror had been. They weren't just fighting an enemy army. They were dismantling a nightmare built on paper, bureaucracy, and cold, calculated cruelty. And then there were the Hitler Youth. American troops expected adult soldiers, but instead they found children, some barely 13, armed with Panzerfausts and shaking with fear. Many had been forced to fight. One US corporal described capturing a boy who still clutched a teddy bear under his arm as he pointed a rocket launcher with the other. It broke the soldiers in ways they didn't expect. But perhaps the most profound shock came when the Americans finally reached the government district. They expected resistance. Instead, they found chaos. Nazi officials had fled or committed suicide. Fires smouldered everywhere. The air was thick with dust and dread. And then they found it the labyrinth of tunnels and bunkers leading toward Hitler's last refuge. Although the Soviets reached the Führer bunker first, American patrols arrived close enough to witness the aftermath. They saw the frantic smoke, the abandoned weapons, the soot-blackened walls, and the overwhelming sense that they were standing at the epicenter of a world-shaking collapse. The symbol of tyranny had been reduced to scorched concrete and silence. For many American soldiers, this moment branded itself into memory. The realization that the war's architect hadn't died in some epic last stand he had hidden underground, clinging to delusion until the final gunshot ended his story. The shock was just that Berlin had fallen. It was how it had fallen through starvation, denial, collapse, and betrayal from within. The city wasn't a fortress. It was a graveyard littered with broken ideology. And for the American troops who walked its ruins on that first day, Berlin was not just the end of the war. It was a haunting reminder of how quickly a powerful modern society could crumble when built on lies, fear, and fanaticism. When American troops pushed deeper into Berlin after that first stunned encounter, the shock only intensified as they began to grasp the scale of psychological collapse, gripping the population, a collapse so profound it felt almost unreal, as if the city had fallen not just physically, but spiritually, morally, fundamentally. Soldiers expected fear, but what they found instead was a mixture of confusion, hysteria, and eerie politeness that made the whole experience unsettling in ways they never forgot. Berliners who had been bombarded by years of Nazi propaganda about Anglo-American monsters were now behaving with an almost embarrassing eagerness to please, apologizing for the state of their ruined homes, bowing nervously as if the Americans were visiting dignitaries instead of enemy soldiers, and offering cups of ersatz coffee brewed from burnt barley, as though it were a peace treaty in liquid form. Some US troops wrote in their diaries that they were more disturbed by the friendliness than they would have been by open hostility. The sudden emotional reversal made Berlin feel like a city suffering from collective whiplash. Yet beneath the politeness simmered something deeper, a city in shock, a city that couldn't decide whether it was relieved or ashamed or terrified, a city that had no idea what future awaited it now that its Führer had abandoned it to die. And among the rubble, the Americans began to uncover the social contradictions that defined the final days of Nazi rule. They found well-stocked Nazi party shelters filled with food, wine, and luxury goods hoarded by officials who had fled days earlier, while children outside were starving. They found looted treasures and household possessions labelled with names of families deported years before, traces of crimes that Berliners now claimed to have known nothing about. Some soldiers discovered basements filled with propaganda materials, prepared for a final victory celebration that would never happen. Others stumbled into hidden rooms where Nazi officials had burned documents until the soot coated the walls like black paint. Every new discovery reinforced the same realization. Berlin had been a city living inside a state-sponsored hallucination, clinging to fantasies until reality crashed through the ceiling. And that reality became even more vivid when American troops entered residential districts untouched by recent combat, yet utterly devastated by years of Allied bombing. These neighborhoods revealed something that caught many soldiers off guard: the sheer magnitude of civilian suffering. Entire apartment blocks had collapsed into jagged piles resembling geological formations rather than architecture. Families lived underground like moles, surviving on ration cards so worthless they were practically jokes. One soldier described entering a cellar and finding 3 families sharing one dim bunker-like room. A baby slept in a drawer padded with rags, an elderly man used a brick as a pillow, and the walls dripped with condensation because the residents hadn't been able to go above ground for weeks. The Americans, used to images of Germans as the well-fed, well-equipped enemy, found themselves confronting a civilian misery that made it harder to maintain the emotional distance soldiers often relied on. Yet even as they felt sympathy, they also felt anger, because in many basements they found swastika flags carefully folded away like precious heirlooms, Hitler portraits still protected in glass frames, and Nazi awards displayed prominently despite the city lying in ruins. The contradiction was glaring. a starving population still clinging to symbols of the regime that had caused their suffering. And then came another shock, the remnants of Nazi fanaticism that refused to die even with Berlin in ashes. While many civilians surrendered instantly, isolated pockets of die-hard resistance continued to fight with suicidal determination. American troops advancing through neighborhoods sometimes came under sudden attack by Volkssturm men, old men with shaking hands, or by teenage Hitler Youth units, launched into battle with Panzerfausts they could barely lift. To the Americans, these encounters were emotionally jarring. They weren't fighting professional soldiers anymore. They were fighting scared children and desperate old men who had been fed lies until the moment they died. One US lieutenant wrote that the hardest part wasn't returning fire, it was realizing that the kids shooting at them had been told they were defending civilization from jazz-playing American devils. Some of these boys had never seen an American before. They thought the soldiers would have horns or fangs. Instead, when captured, they broke down crying, their propaganda fueled. Nightmares evaporating the moment they saw that the enemy was just a tired young man handing them a chocolate bar. But the psychological unraveling didn't end there. As American units explored the governmental and administrative districts, they began to find the deserted offices of Nazi ministries eerie time capsules, each one frozen at the moment the officials had fled. Typewriters still held half-finished orders, half-eaten meals rotted on desks. Maps on the walls showed imaginary troop movements meant to convince Hitler that victory was still possible. These offices reeked of panic, abandonment, and denial. One soldier described entering a propaganda ministry building where the last broadcast had been scripted. The final radio orders lying on the desk instructed German citizens to fight to the last breath, even though the broadcasters had already escaped the city. The hypocrisy was staggering, but the most disturbing shock came in the medical and research facilities the Americans stumbled upon. Inside some abandoned laboratories, they found equipment and files related to experiments carried out in the name of racial science. Charts detailing skull measurements, diagrams illustrating forced sterilization procedures, and research notes on malnutrition studies conducted on prisoners filled the rooms. Even seasoned soldiers found themselves nauseated as they pieced together the scale and cruelty of the pseudoscience the regime had pursued. It was one thing to hear rumours about Nazi atrocities. It was another to see the paperwork, the calculations, the signatures of doctors who had twisted medicine into torture. Yet amidst all this horror, American troops encountered another contradiction, the bizarre attempts of some Berliners to continue living normally despite everything. In certain neighbourhoods, women swept the pavements as if tidying the ruins would magically restore the city. Men emerged in tattered suits, trying to maintain dignity even as bombs had blown open the walls of their apartments. People lined up at makeshift bakeries hoping for bread that rarely arrived. The illusion of normalcy was so surreal that American troops often stopped to stare, unsure whether to feel admiration or sadness. And then there were the cultural shocks. US soldiers entered buildings that had once been symbols of Nazi power: opera houses, film studios, museums now stripped bare, looted, or half collapsed. In one famous incident, a group of Americans wandered into a ruined concert hall where the sheet music for Wagner's operas still sat on music stands surrounded by shattered marble. The contrast between the city's artistic grandeur and the barbarism of its leadership hit the soldiers like a punch to the chest. Berlin wasn't just a defeated capital. It was a fallen civilization, one that had drowned its brilliance in blood, ideology, and destruction. But if there was one discovery that encapsulated the shock American troops felt, it was the city underground world, the labyrinth of bunkers, tunnels, and shelters that snaked beneath the ruins. As they ventured deeper underground, the soldiers encountered environments that felt like something out of a dystopian nightmare. Air stale with the breath of thousands, walls blackened with smoke from makeshift fires, and notes scrawled on walls begging for help that had never arrived. Some bunkers still contained bodies, victims of suffocation or suicide. Others were filled with civilians too frightened to emerge, blinking in disbelief when they realized the soldiers who found them weren't Soviet troops, and therefore not the monsters Nazi propaganda had described. In these subterranean tombs of a dying city, the Americans confronted the full psychological grip the regime had maintained until the bitter end. And by the time US troops emerged back into the daylight, Berlin no longer seemed like an enemy city at all. It seemed like a cautionary tale carved into stone and ash. It was a place where ideology had replaced reason, where obedience had crushed humanity, and where an entire population had been dragged into catastrophe by leaders who treated truth as expendable. For the Americans, the shock wasn't just in the ruins they walked through, it was in the realization that a modern, educated, sophisticated society had willingly followed a path that ended in this apocalyptic wasteland. Berlin was no longer simply the enemy's capital. It was a warning from history, one they could breathe in with every step they took across its shattered streets. As American soldiers pushed farther into Berlin's devastated core, the shock deepened not only through what they saw but through what they heard and what they didn't hear. The silence of the city became its own kind of psychological battlefield, made even more haunting by the occasional jarring eruptions of violence that shattered it without warning. A city that had once pulsed with Nazi marches, propaganda broadcasts, and the clatter of industry now sounded like an abandoned world interrupted only by distant Soviet artillery. The skittering of rats across collapsed stone, and the soft, almost ghost-like murmurs of civilians emerging hesitantly from cellars. But the silence was never complete. Every so often, shots rang out from snipers hidden in the ruins. Many Americans weren't shocked that snipers remained active. They were shocked who the snipers often were. Sometimes it was a die-hard SS soldier, but just as often it was a terrified teenager from the Hitler Youth, or a civilian woman clutching a rifle she barely knew how to use. One US sergeant wrote that nothing disturbed him more than spotting a sniper position in a blown-out apartment block, only to discover that the shooter was a girl no older than 15 with pigtails and a school uniform under her tattered jacket. She had been told that the Americans would torture her family if she didn't fight. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely pull the trigger. The moral weight of this kind of combat shook seasoned veterans in ways enemy fire never had. And yet, amid the disturbing resistance, Americans also encountered equally shocking scenes of surrender mass, frantic, disorganized surrender. As word spread that American units had entered the city, civilians began displaying white cloths in windows, waving torn shirts on sticks, or emerging with their hands raised high even if no soldier was in sight. Entire families approached American patrols with white scarves, crying in relief, dropping to their knees, or kissing the boots of soldiers who had no idea how to react to such displays. One young infantryman described being so overwhelmed by a mother who kept thanking him in broken English that he felt guilty for not knowing what to say. Another wrote that an old man grabbed his hand and wouldn't let go, sobbing uncontrollably, because he believed the Americans would spare his daughters from the horrors he expected from the advancing Soviets. For many Berliners, surrendering to the Americans wasn't just capitulation, it was salvation. But what stunned US troops most were the rumours whispering through the ruins, rumours from Berliners themselves, twisted by fear, propaganda and desperation. Some believed the Americans had come to replace Hitler with a new government immediately. Others thought US soldiers were angels or divine messengers ending the apocalypse. Still others, poisoned by Nazi propaganda, were convinced the Americans would kill all men and enslave all women. The confusion bordered on madness, and American troops found themselves acting not just as soldiers, but as impromptu psychologists, trying to calm a population raised on lies. The psychological disarray of Berlin was confined to civilians. The Americans encountered captured German soldiers who seemed emotionally broken in ways US troops had not previously seen on the Western Front. Many surrendered instantly, dropping their weapons and begging for mercy. Some were so malnourished their uniforms hung off them like oversized costumes. Others were clearly relieved to fall into American hands instead of Soviet ones, but their relief was mixed with humiliation, disbelief, and a haunted expression soldiers later struggled to describe the look of men who had built their identity on a 1,000-year Reich, now watching it die in less than 12. Some German officers attempted to maintain dignity, saluting formally as they surrendered. Others collapsed, weeping, muttering to themselves that Hitler had betrayed them. One American medic wrote that he treated a German lieutenant who kept repeating, "He lied to us, he lied to us, he lied to us," until he lost consciousness. But the most shocking encounter came from the stories emerging among German civilians, stories of mass suicides occurring across the city in the days before and after Berlin fell. As American soldiers moved through apartments, they found scenes that froze them in place. Families who had collectively taken poison, mothers lying beside lifeless children, empty pill bottles on the floor, men who had hanged themselves with belts in hallways, entire households silent in death, their windows blown open by shockwaves, curtains fluttering like flags of surrender to a tragedy that had already played out. These discoveries hit the Americans harder than any firefight. They were forced to confront the psychological grip the Nazi regime had held over its population, so powerful that many preferred death to defeat. What truly horrified the troops was learning that some suicides had not been voluntary. In several cases, neighbours told them, party loyalists forced people to take poison. In others, Fathers believed they were sparing their families from the brutality of invading armies. The city had become a desperate, chaotic maze of fear where rational thought collapsed under the weight of hopelessness. Yet even as they witnessed the city's psychological collapse, the Americans also encountered Berlin's unexpected underground culture, its black market. In the middle of the ruins, commerce had found a way to survive. Children became smugglers, women traded jewellery or family heirlooms for bread, cigarettes became more valuable than gold. American soldiers were shocked when Berliners offered them priceless watches, silver cutlery, even rare paintings in exchange for a single pack of lucky strikes. Many soldiers didn't know how to respond. They weren't thieves, but they were suddenly placed in a morally grey zone created by desperation. Some refused everything. Others traded food, not for valuables, but for information about snipers, mines, or unexploded ordnance. The black market was a strange mirror of Berlin itself, broken, desperate, yet stubbornly alive. But one of the most shocking aspects of the occupation was how quickly Berliners adapted to American cultural influence. Within days, children began following soldiers through the streets, begging for chewing gum, chocolate, or candy. Women tried to speak English phrases they had learned from forbidden jazz records or American movies watched in secret before the war. Some civilians even asked soldiers to teach them swing dance steps right there on the rubble. The city, starved of freedom and normality, clung to every scrap of American culture like a lifeline. But the Americans weren't prepared for the emotional complexity this created. They were liberators to some, conquerors to others, symbols of hope for many, and reminders of defeat for a few. The psychological strain of navigating these conflicting expectations left soldiers feeling like they had stepped into a moral labyrinth. And the shocks kept coming. When US troops entered abandoned Nazi Party buildings, they discovered libraries filled with banned books, Einstein, Hemingway, Freud, Marx books Germans risked imprisonment to hide. Some Berliners proudly revealed secret stashes of enemy literature, as if displaying proof that they had resisted the regime privately, even if they could not do so publicly. One American soldier, amazed to find a family reading a forbidden copy of Gone with the Wind, wrote that it was the first time he realized how many Germans had quietly hated the dictatorship, but were too terrified to oppose it. Yet the Americans also encountered civilians who still clung to Nazi ideology even as the city crumbled. Some cursed at the soldiers, shouting that they were invaders destroying Germany. Others defended Hitler, claiming he was betrayed by his generals. A few even insisted the war was not over, and that secret weapons would soon turn the tide. These encounters stunned American troops, not because they were dangerous, but because they revealed the extraordinary depths of indoctrination. It was one thing to defeat an army, it was another to confront a belief system so deeply ingrained that no amount of destruction could uproot it instantly. And then there were the physical dangers lurking in every corner of the ruined city. Americans were shocked at how Berlin seemed to conspire against them unintentionally. Streets were riddled with unexploded bombs, buildings collapsed without warning, fires erupted spontaneously when winds stirred smouldering ruins. Soldiers walking patrols sometimes had to crawl through streets because the rubble was too unstable to stand on. Even drinking water was a hazard, contaminated by broken sewage lines and decomposing bodies hidden under debris. Every step in Berlin felt like walking through a haunted maze of lethal traps. But the most shocking discovery came from their encounters with survivors of Nazi persecution people who had been hiding for years in attics, closets, and underground shelters. American troops found Jewish families who were starving, terrified, and unable to believe that liberation had arrived. They found political prisoners too weak to walk. They found foreign labourers who had escaped forced labour camps and were hiding in the ruins, afraid the SS would return. Many soldiers wrote that meeting these survivors fundamentally changed how they understood the war. It wasn't just about defeating an enemy. It was about rescuing the victims of a regime that had tried to erase them from history. By the time American troops reached the heart of Berlin standing amid the skeletal remains of government buildings, the smoke-filled air of the Chancellery ruins, and the psychological collapse of a city that once embodied totalitarian power, they were no longer shocked merely by destruction. They were shocked by the full, overwhelming realization that they were witnessing the death of not just a city, but an entire worldview. Berlin wasn't just defeated, it was broken, hollow, exhausted, a monument to the dangers of unchecked ideology and blind obedience. And the Americans, walking through its ruins, felt as though they had stepped into the final chapter of a nightmare written by history itself. As American troops pressed deeper toward Berlin's governmental nerve centers, the shocks they encountered took on a new dimension, not just physical or psychological, but ideological. like they were peeling away the layers of a collapsed empire and finding each one more disturbing than the last. For soldiers who had spent the war fighting across fields, hedgerows, forests, and shattered towns, the German capital felt like an archaeological dig through the ruins of a belief system, a kind of dark museum preserved by catastrophe. The first thing that struck them as they neared the Reichstag, the Chancellery, and the ministries surrounding Wilhelmstrasse was the sheer scale of destruction. Buildings that had been symbols of Nazi power, their images plastered across magazines and newsreels, were now jagged, mangled skeletons. The Reichstag's great dome, once a proud architectural feat, had been obliterated, its iron ribs exposed like the bones of a dead beast. Fires still smouldered inside, sending smoke through shattered windows, giving the appearance that the building itself was sighing out its last breaths. US soldiers, who had expected at least some portion of these iconic structures to be intact, found instead a landscape that felt post-apocalyptic, as if the city had been consumed by a force far greater than bombs. This was not like entering Paris or even Rome. This was stepping into the remains of a civilization that had imploded. But what shocked them even more was the evidence of the city's final days imprinted on every surface. Inside the government quarter, the Americans found streets littered with spent shell casings, charred vehicles, and the bodies of soldiers who had died days earlier. SS uniforms lay scattered like abandoned costumes, some still folded neatly, as if their wearers had decided in their last moments that they wanted to remove their affiliation before fate caught up with them. The closer the troops came to the Chancellery, the more surreal everything felt. Massive bomb craters pockmarked the ground. Crushed marble statues lay half buried under rubble, their faces broken, their hands reaching to nothing. The giant eagle of the Third Reich, once displayed proudly on government facades, now lay face down in the dirt, wings snapped off, beak cracked open. For many American soldiers, this eerie imagery made the fall of Berlin feel almost mythic, like the downfall of an ancient empire that had grown too arrogant. And then they reached the Chancellery itself, a monstrous ruin that felt equal parts fortress and tomb. The building that had once housed Hitler's office, the place where decisions of life and death for millions had been made, was now a charred warren of broken hallways, collapsed ceilings, and shattered glass. American troops wandered through the ruins in stunned silence, not because they expected to find Hitler himself, but because they were confronted with the sheer emptiness of the dictatorship as centre. Papers were strewn everywhere, propaganda drafts, orders, speeches. Portraits of Hitler and other Nazi leaders lay cracked on the floor like discarded icons of a dying cult. One soldier described entering a room that had clearly once hosted high-ranking meetings. The long table was still there, but it was burned, warped, and covered in soot. The chairs splintered into fragments. The wallpaper peeled in long strips, exposing scorched plaster underneath. It was as if the room had tried to erase its own history. And then came the most shocking revelations what lay beneath the Chancellery. American troops were not the first to reach the Führerbunker. The Soviets had arrived earlier. But the Americans explored portions of the underground complex, guided by German civilians, captured soldiers, or sometimes simply their own curiosity. What they found felt like descending into the heart of madness. The bunker corridors smelled of smoke, sweat, and decay. The walls were stained with soot. Personal belongings were scattered everywhere. Shoes, gas masks, medicine bottles, half-eaten food left behind in the panic of the last days. In several rooms, soldiers found charred remains of documents that Nazi officials had attempted to burn before fleeing or committing suicide. The partially destroyed records offered glimpses into the final hours of a regime in freefall orders drafted but never delivered. Evacuation plans scribbled then crossed out. Frantic notes pleading for reinforcements that never came. The most disturbing moment for many Americans came when they encountered the rooms used by Hitler's inner circle. One chamber still smelled of cigar smoke and stale coffee. Maps hung askew on the walls, marked with troop positions that no longer existed. The atmosphere was suffocating thick with the weight of the decisions made there, decisions that had shaped the world for 12 harrowing years and brought tens of millions to their deaths. For some soldiers, the bunker felt cursed, for others, it felt anticlimactic. One remarked that it looked less like the command centre of a feared dictator and more like a rat hole where a coward died. But the shock didn't come only from the bunker's existence. It came from understanding what kind of world had been sustained underground while Berlin burned above. The contrast was grotesque. While civilians starved, while children fought with Panzerfausts, while families committed suicide out of fear, Hitler and his inner circle had lived in a sealed environment with electric lights, stocked pantries, and carefully prepared meals. The dichotomy between the underground luxury and the devastation above ground enraged many American soldiers. It felt like the ultimate betrayal, the clearest evidence that the Nazi regime had never cared for its people, only for its leaders and their delusions. But even as they processed this anger, American troops were struck by other shocking discoveries in the surrounding districts, what remained of Berlin's once grand cultural, scientific and intellectual institutions. Libraries had been bombed to ashes, universities lay in ruins, museums were stripped, their collections stolen, hidden or destroyed. The Americans found burnt books piled in courtyards, their pages curling like blackened petals. They found laboratories filled with smashed equipment, chalkboards covered with equations that would never be completed. They found opera houses with their stages collapsed, musical scores buried under debris. It felt to many soldiers like witnessing the death of a civilization that had once been among the brightest in Europe. Yet the collapse was not just physical, it was moral. American troops found evidence of the intellectual corruption that had fueled the Nazi regime. Walls were covered with propaganda charts illustrating racial hierarchies. Scientific journals had been rewritten to support political ideology. In some university ruins, the Americans discovered lecture halls with slogans praising Hitler still etched onto walls that were barely standing. The realization hit them hard. This wasn't just a city destroyed by war, it was a city destroyed by belief, by ideology masquerading as truth, by a culture that had twisted itself into a weapon. And as they walked through these ruins, the Americans encountered survivors whose stories brought these realizations into painful focus. Professors who had been dismissed for their heritage or beliefs, artists who had hidden their work to escape censorship, scientists who had been forced to abandon their research or turn it toward military applications they despised. Their testimonies revealed a Berlin that had been dying long before the bombs fell, a city suffocated by fear, silence, and state control. But the greatest emotional shock came when American troops witnessed the aftermath of the Reichwehr's last acts of fanaticism. In several locations near the city centre, they found groups of Volkssturm fighters, teenage boys and elderly men lying dead near makeshift barricades. These men had been thrown into battle with almost no training, no adequate weapons, and no hope. American soldiers stood over their bodies realizing that these were not hardened warriors. They were pawns in a dictator's final tantrum. Nearby they discovered notes written by these doomed fighters goodbyes to families, apologies for failing, messages begging future generations not to repeat the mistakes of the past. These discoveries haunted the Americans, driving home the tragic futility of Berlin's final days. In the end, Part 4 of their experience was defined by a single overwhelming realization. Berlin had not simply been beaten by superior military force, it had been devoured from within by paranoia, delusion, fanaticism, and betrayal. The shock the Americans felt came not just from witnessing destruction, but from understanding the human choices that had led to it. Berlin was the corpse of an ideology, and every street, every basement, every bunker whispered its epitaph. For American troops standing in the heart of ruined Berlin, with smoke still rising from the Chancellery ruins and the echoes of the last gunshots fading into the choking silence, the final and most profound shock was not found in any building, bunker, or bomb crater. It was found in the people who emerged from the shadows, revealing the human cost of a dictatorship that had drained its capital dry long before the Allies arrived. By May 1945, the Americans who patrolled the shattered streets had become reluctant witnesses to the psychological unmasking of a society that had, for 12 years, lived behind a wall of lies. At first, the troops had viewed Berlin through the lens of war, a battlefield, an objective, a fortress. But slowly, as they interacted with its surviving inhabitants, the city transformed from an enemy stronghold into a cautionary tale etched into every face they encountered. Every Berliner, young or old, seemed to carry a different story, yet all of those stories pointed to the same truth. The Nazi regime had not only destroyed nations abroad, but had devoured its own citizens from within. And so, the Americans found themselves encountering endless scenes that shocked them in ways even combat had not prepared them for. They saw mothers wandering the streets with hollow eyes, searching for children lost in the chaos of the final battle. They saw elderly men wearing medals from World War I, their dignity stripped away as they begged for bread or water. They saw former Nazi officials trying desperately to reinvent themselves as victims, hiding their party pins, burying their uniforms, and claiming they had been opposed to Hitler all along, even while the ruins around them contradicted their stories. The Americans were astounded by how quickly some Berliners tried to rewrite their personal histories in the hopes of survival. One sergeant described it perfectly. Berlin was a city not only in ruins but in denial. And then there were the children, perhaps the most shocking sight of all. Thousands of them roamed the city like ghosts, some orphaned by bombs, others separated from families during the evacuation panic. Many traumatized by the violence they had witnessed. They were starving, dirty, terrified, and so accustomed to war that the appearance of American soldiers barely surprised them. Some approached troops asking for chocolate, others asked where their parents were. Some simply followed patrols because they had nowhere else to go. One American soldier wrote that nothing haunted him more than seeing a group of children playing war in the rubble, not with toy guns, but with real weapons they had scavenged from the dead. The psychological damage inflicted on an entire generation of Berlin's youth was visible in every interaction, and it left American troops feeling helpless and heartbroken. But perhaps the deepest shock came from the survivors, who emerged only after the fighting had fully ended. Jews who had been hiding for months or years in attics, basements, abandoned apartments, and even in underground canals. These were the remnants of Berlin's Jewish community, once vibrant, now reduced to a handful of emaciated, terrified individuals who struggled to believe that liberation had truly come. When American soldiers encountered them, they were confronted with a level of human suffering that far exceeded even the horrors of battle. Some survivors cried openly upon seeing the Americans' uniforms. Others were too weak to stand. They spoke in whispers, afraid the liberation was a trick or that the Gestapo would return at any moment. The soldiers, many of whom had lost friends in the fight against Nazism, were stunned and angered by the realization that the enemy they had fought for so long had committed atrocities not in distant camps alone, but in the very cellars and neighborhoods around them. One lieutenant wrote in his diary that meeting these survivors was the moment when he finally understood the true nature of the war not as a clash of armies, but as a fight for the soul of the world. And yet, even as the Americans processed these emotional revelations, they were confronted by another unexpected shock: the extraordinary speed with which Berliners tried to resume normal life. Within days of the city's fall, makeshift markets appeared among the ruins. Women set up small stalls selling anything they could find: pots, clothes, trinkets, even bricks salvaged from rubble. Men dragged carts full of scrap metal, wood, or coal, trying to rebuild their lives from literal wreckage. Children crafted toys from shrapnel, tin cans, and pieces of destroyed vehicles. The Americans watched in amazement as Berliners swept streets that no longer led anywhere, planted flowers in bomb craters, and patched their clothing with whatever fabric they could find. It was as if the population, having reached the absolute bottom, was determined to claw its way back to humanity piece by piece. But the Americans also noticed another darker attempt at normalcy, the effort by many Berliners to erase their Nazi past as quickly as possible. Banners were torn down, propaganda posters ripped away, badges hidden, uniforms burned. Many insisted they had never supported Hitler, even though party membership had soared earlier in the war. Some claimed they had no knowledge of concentration camps, deportations, or mass killings, even though some of those operations had been coordinated from the very buildings now lying in ruins. American troops were stunned by how widespread this sudden amnesia seemed to be. One soldier remarked, "It was as if the entire city was trying to pretend the last 12 years never happened." But the ruins around them told the truth, and the Americans had seen too much to be fooled. Their shock gradually transformed into a sober understanding. Totalitarianism didn't just destroy buildings, it destroyed honesty, accountability, and even self-awareness. Yet, the US occupation stabilized. Something else shocked the Americans, something hopeful. Berlin, for all its devastation, began to show signs of resilience. People laughed again, however briefly. Music was played on salvaged instruments. Someone set up a makeshift movie screen against the wall of a collapsed building and projected old films for children gathered in the rubble. Churches held services outdoors because their sanctuaries had been gutted. Writers scribbled poems in notebooks. Painters sketched the ruins. Even in a city drowning in tragedy, creativity flickered stubbornly back to life. And the Americans, who had entered Berlin expecting to face hatred or resistance, found instead that many Berliners embraced them not as conquerors, but as protectors, teachers, and even friends. Soldiers played soccer with local kids, shared their rations with hungry families, and helped civilians repair homes. In a strange way, the Americans became part of the city's healing process. But even as bonds formed and life resumed, the greatest, most haunting shock remained. The realization that Berlin had been destroyed not only by bombs and bullets, but by ideas so powerful, so intoxicating, and so poisonous that they had convinced millions to surrender their humanity. The Americans had witnessed a city where children had been turned into soldiers, where neighbours had turned against each other, where truth had been replaced with propaganda, and where obedience had outweighed conscience. They saw firsthand how easily a society could be manipulated, how quickly freedom could be extinguished, and how devastating the consequences could be when fear becomes a government's most effective weapon. And so, as American troops finally prepared to leave Berlin or transition to occupation duties, they carried with them memories that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They remembered the ruined buildings, the starving civilians, the frightened children, the survivors emerging from hiding, and the eerie silence of a city that had once controlled the fate of a continent. But above all, they remembered the shock of discovering that the enemy they had fought was not simply an army, but an entire world built on lies, fear, and fanaticism. That was the true revelation of Berlin, not the destruction, not the surrender, but the understanding that a modern society, advanced and educated, had allowed itself to be consumed by a darkness of its own making. The Americans had come expecting victory. Instead, they found a warning written in ash. This is what happens when truth dies, when power goes unchecked, and when humanity forgets its own reflection. And as they marched away from the ruins of Hitler's capital, watching the shattered city slowly begin to breathe again, they understood that they had not just witnessed the end of a war, they had witnessed the rebirth of a world that would spend generations trying to ensure that such darkness never rose again